If you've ever been at least mildly interested in the fashion scene, then you would have witnessed something quite odd. The obsession with labels, brands, logos, and names. This particular approach to buying clothes is slowly becoming more prevalent. This could be called brand obsession. Looking back throughout recent history, famous designers have always been the dominant talking point of those heavily vested in the world of fashion. Apparently, names can speak louder than looks, and thus the focus for fashion designers is often to follow the trends that the biggest names seem to etch out. Nothing has really changed in the upper echelons of the fashion industry, but it has for the average consumer. If you were to think of what draws you to a particular clothing item, or rather what should draw you to one, perhaps it would be its aesthetic quality in relation to your own aesthetic qualities. Does this fit well with me, you might ask yourself. This is still the case for most, but not all. For some reason, the primary concern of one's sense of fashion has been shifted by mainstream culture. It now lies in brand names. Perhaps it's worth asking oneself, why do we actually want to own this when looking at a particular piece of clothing or shoes? Why this brand, the most expensive variation? There are plenty that look similar or even better for a fraction of the price, so why this? It could be claimed that you wouldn't buy another brand because it won't last as long, or something such as that. The truth is that this has very little to do with longevity. It has to do with posturing oneself to the world. Cultural capital is an old idea. It is flawed and extremely objective in its presuppositions, but nevertheless offers some subjective ideas as to why people may be so obsessed with brand. Items can be an indication of status, age, background, goals, and personality. Someone who drives a McLaren F1 is most likely very wealthy, has an interest in cars of some sort, and is probably driving around on a day off. After all, who drives such a rare machine on the daily? These are just some of the basic presumptions one can map to an individual based off of a vehicle. And of course, it's quite subjective. But nevertheless, it gives you some insight. Similarly, branded clothing and fashion accessories say a lot about a person, at least subconsciously when you see them, whether it's true or not. It's only natural to correlate someone dressed in a suit or dressed in around-the-house clothing with a particular idea of who that person might be or how they might act.
My mom got me these. Shout out, Mom.
This fits within the framework of cultural capital to an extent, which states that anything that society deems worth seeking is therefore a tool. The way you dress defines how others will perceive you, particularly if they don't know a lot about you or don't know you at all. This is then utilized to help you move up the social ladder, or at least convince people that you are, so that you might actually be able to do that in the future. Brands become associated with particular individuals or cultural movements. Actors and influencers wear a particular brand, musicians sing about it, retailers inflate the prices, and all of it give you the illusion that it has value. If only you owned it, then perhaps you too could be part of this movement, and give others the illusion that you were moving up in the social hierarchy. The cost of this is the partial or full sacrifice of aesthetic choice. Sure, some brands create jackets, shirts, pants, and caps, and shoes that could look good on you, but you could look better. Maybe there's something else that would look great, but it's not branded. Of course, that would require giving up the brand name, and with it, a shot at undefined success. The various types of cultural capital and its claims can be a boxed-in way of viewing personal interactions and their constituents, but the model gets the point across. Perhaps the most comedic element of all of this is the claim of originality. Just like experimental modern art, the aim with much of this appears not to be creating something beautiful and aesthetically appealing, although there certainly are some that aim for that, but generally it's rather playing into a cultural phenomenon. Much like any cultural movement, those most vested in it are keen on the idea of fitting in, being part of something bigger than themselves. Perhaps thinking that the value of a brand name adds some sort of intrinsic value to oneself when it is worn, or at least if you own it. But at the same time, many also want to stand out, perhaps for creative purposes or maybe just to continue the climb up the social hierarchy, to be known. The reality is that huge, ill-defined in-groups do form around particular movements across the cultural landscape, but as a result become somewhat all-encompassing of its standout elements. The individual can no longer stand out. Perhaps they would have been better not joining to begin with, and thus would have stood out maybe a bit more. All of this culminates in something quite interesting, which almost comes full circle to where we started. The idea that any of this had any value to begin with. Going back several years, many marketing strategists realized that fashion sells itself, based purely off of aesthetic qualities. You would see an unmarked dress or shirt in a store and buy it based off of how it looked. But this, for the corporations selling things, also leads to a level of stagnation. A company such as Nike might lose its competitive edge if it decides to advance in the production of more stylish clothing, but ignore brand recognition. It would still make considerable sales, but it could make far more. This was even more so the case with smaller niche labels which had small turnovers in comparison to larger competing brands. And thus, the race for cultural influence picked up pace. It's at this point that it's worth highlighting the fact that such marketing tactics have always been used, but never to the extent that we see today. This may be a result of a rapidly changing and increasingly volatile economic structure. Who knows? Regardless, the need for stronger market certainty rested, particularly for smaller brands, on this approach. Do something exciting, controversial, hire a celebrity, pay for a name drop in an interview or song or Instagram story. The list is endless. The end goal is the same. Create a sense of value and profit. So what does this all mean? Well, really it doesn't mean a whole lot at all. People will obsess over social status and find ways of faking movement up and down this social hierarchy. And corporations, becoming increasingly desperate due to the volatility of the economy or whatever other driving reasons they have, attempt to monopolize this instinctive desire. But who's to blame them? What we are left with is a generation of status-obsessed, insecure individuals who, in their quest to stand out, have only further fallen into the new norm without even realizing it. And the world keeps on spinning.